In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning around the world. Welcome to Pakhuis de Zwijger special livecast on the book presentation and debate After Us, the Deluge. The book is by Kadir van Lohuizen, but we have a panel from around the world to talk about climate change, and not only the increasing impacts with more floods and droughts and wildfires across the world, but also where it comes from and how can we change course as soon as possible, of course. I'm very honored. I'm Henk Ovink, Special Envoy for International Water Affairs, and I worked with Kadir van Lohuizen, try to help him a bit on the book and many other projects. But I'm very honored to have a distinguished panel, of course, with Kadir van Lohuizen, World Press Photo winner and a traveler around the world, chasing the challenges our societies face, being them social, environmental, justice, political, and of course in the context of climate. And then we have Anote Tong. Anote Tong is former president of Kiribati and a strong climate activist. When he was president, he advocated for the rights and the position of small island and development states in the climate debate, ensuring that that position was captured all the way towards the Paris Agreement. And he continues this fight. And it's way past midnight for Anote Tong, so we're very happy and honored that he is with us. From Bangladesh, Salim Hook, good friend, but also director for the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh, and your special advisor to the Global Center on Adaptation. Welcome, Salim. You're also a driver in the UN process on climate action, bringing on board NGOs into the formal conversation, organizing the Sunday in between in the climate COPs. So thank you also. You're here from Bangladesh. It's also late, but a little less late than with Anote. And Diederik Samsom. Diederik is head of the cabinet for the first vice president for the European Commission, Frans Timmermans. And Diederik moved from Greenpeace to politics, from politics in The Hague to the European Commission, driving the climate and greening agenda. And we really want to know why in Europe, in this European stage, we have to make the difference. So thank you, Diederik, for joining us in your busy schedule. And online also Dorte Dahl-Jensen. Hello, Dorte, welcome. An Arctic scientist at the Center for Ice and Climate at the Niels Bohr Institute at the University of Copenhagen, but also at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg on the Arctic, doing research on, well, where our planet is falling apart, if you would say it in the most direct way, and trying to get the best sense and understanding why that is happening, and why changing course is so of such critical importance. And I think the message from science to politics, to policymakers, to industries, businesses and NGOs is of critical importance. It was Secretary General Guterres who said, science and solidarity should be the main drivers for action we face, by facts and together. We need to change course. And here in Amsterdam, at Pakhuis de Zwijger, I'm joined by Marjan Minnesma, director and founder of the foundation Urgenda in the Netherlands. And the Urgenda led the case against the Dutch government, saying the Dutch government is not delivering on its promise. There is a Paris Agreement. We have an agreement in 2015 where we said the world cannot be warmer than 2 degrees post-industrial levels, better 1.5. And you went to court to challenge the government for delivering on that promise, and you won. Took a bit, but then you want, so we really want to hear from you how that is going, where you see progress, but also where you see the downside. And of course, Kadir van Lohuizen, good friend, amazing photographer, challenging the world with your images, showcasing the importance of action, and traveling the world, well, not last year, but normally. And you made this book, After Us, the Deluge. It is perhaps your second project in the context of raising awareness and in our faces on the challenging impacts of climate change. Can you tell a little bit about the book, a little bit about your work, and why did you make this book?
Yes, well, very happy that it's here. It's actually kind of the conclusion of a very long project, which I started already back in 2011. And I was traveling on another project about migration in the Americas, and I got to these beautiful islands in Panama. And that's where I kind of realized what was happening, because I was interviewing people there, and they said they had to be evacuated. And they said, we have to be evacuated because the sea level is rising. So although I'm Dutch and we're sitting here in Amsterdam far below sea level, I didn't realize up till that moment that this was already happening as we speak. Back in that day already. So that was the start of a big research into this project, and finding locations, regions in the world to show really the urgency of the matter. And that the sea level is rising, I think it's common knowledge by now, but that this is affecting such large amounts of people, communities around the world, I think is still not very much known. And it's not a question if the sea level is rising, it's the question when it's happening. Yeah. So this is the conclusion of basically 10 years work. Yeah. And I'm very happy that it's a book. It's not only a photo book, it has the beautiful essays of people like Marjan Minnesma, of Mr. Arnaud de Tong, of it's...
But you traveled the world, you went to these places that are at the forefront of climate change impact. And this is the US, the UK, the Netherlands, Bangladesh, small island and development states across. Impacts of climate change occur everywhere. And at the same time, how we deal with them, the people in the places at risk, as well as decision makers and investors, is different. The book is also a cry of pain, in a way, a call to the world to change course.
Yeah, well, and it's visual proof. Yeah. You know, I mean, we can still try to deny it and say that it's not so serious and that maybe it's not going to be as worse as being predicted by almost every scientist. But we treat this, I'd rather call it a climate crisis and not climate change, because I think there is a real urgency and we really need to act today. That we have to do something, and we cannot treat this as something which is maybe not as serious as it is, like we do with COVID-19. We treat it as very serious. We have very tight restrictions, not only in the Netherlands, but almost everywhere, to prevent, right? And with the climate crisis, we don't seem to actually are willing to face this.
You see also two other things. One is that there is a big difference between the global north and the global south in the way it's being dealt with, and how there is an opportunity also for a way forward. And the second, do you also see hope? Are there places around the world that inspire and say, hey, this is where the crisis is taken seriously head on, and there is an opportunity for at least a pathway that leads us to a better future?
Yeah, to answer your first question, I mean, I've met Mr. Arnaud de Tong when he was still president. We met twice. He was the president of Kiribati, one of the small island states in the Pacific. But obviously, you know, I mean, those states which have almost zero emission, they pay a very high price. And I think that's why Mr. Tong is such a strong advocate for the plight of his people, because it might be one of the countries which will disappear. And in Bangladesh, where I met Salim Hook, Yes, obviously they have a huge coastline. It's very densely populated, but I think people are very much more aware what's happening than in places like even the Netherlands.
Yeah. So the urgency and the awareness, also the understanding by not only science but by practice, can lead to better pathways, but a global stepping up, massive stepping up is of critical importance. Okay, thank you, Kadir. We'll loop you into the conversation, of course, but I will now go to first former President Anote Tong. Again, thank you for joining us. I start with my first question, and the first question is really personal. You in your role as president in Kiribati and then now as a climate crisis activist, quoting Kadir, why? Can you tell us the story of yourself? Why you are such an activist rallying the world to do better?
Thank you, Henk. And let me begin with a blessing. I think we must bless each other every time we interact. This is important. So in our culture, we bless each other. So let me bless you, Kamdamori, meaning may you be blessed. And let me also take this opportunity to thank you for this conversation and acknowledge my fellow panelists. And of course, I congratulate you, Kadir, on this wonderful publication. It's a journey through the different parts of the world to see the impacts of what's happening on climate change. Here we are sitting from different sides, from Bangladesh, from Europe, and but we are talking about the one issue. The climate change is certainly the greatest challenge ever to face humanity. I've always referred to it as the greatest moral challenge facing humanity, and the reason is because it's so entwined with so much injustice, and there's such a moral issue in all of this, because the question now that we will be facing, and I will come back to that later, is what happens to countries like mine, who will certainly, as Kadir has said, who certainly are likely to be submerged as the sea rises. Climate change is an existential threat for small countries on the front line of climate change. And so that's been my mission since coming into office in 2003. The question that I asked is, what is relevant? What can I talk about at the United Nations General Assembly? And of course, I've been reading reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And to me, it was so obvious that we need to highlight the human dimension of climate change. Climate change is not about the science. It's not just about the environment. It's really about people. And I think that has to be brought to the forefront. And that's been my mission, to highlight the gross injustice, that there are actually people at the end of this catastrophe. And they will be, we've always regarded ourselves as being on the front line. And the reason is because we will be affected, but later on, other countries and people will be affected. It's not confined to us alone. And so the question will be, what are we to do? Can we stop this? And the simple answer is no, it doesn't seem likely. What are the implications for countries on the front line, like Kiribati in the Pacific, Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, the Maldives in the Indian Ocean? What is to be their future as climate change impacts continue to get worse? And I think on the basis of the scientific projections, we are doomed to be underwater in the decades ahead. And so what becomes of our people with the loss of their homeland? And so in my desperation, I've come forward with a number of radical solutions, including floating islands, building up the islands. But of course, we must never lose sight of the brutal reality that one day our people may have to relocate. And I think it's already happening in different parts of the world. We see a massive migration of people from North Africa into Europe, whether those are climate change driven or not. But I can see this possible eventuality happening in our part of the world. And so the question will be, how do we deal with it? Is the international community, is the global community ready to deal with this? And so far, it doesn't seem possible, because I think to some extent there is a certain degree of denial, not looking at the challenge and trying to avoid answering that question. And so we continue to look for solutions. I don't see any solutions, and one of the proposals that I put forward is the idea of acknowledging the reality that we may have to relocate, but to relocate as migrants with dignity, migration with dignity, so that we don't repeat what's been happening in different parts of the world, where there's been massive migration and there's been tension between the different ethnic groups. I think in Europe, you're experiencing that. And so to try to avoid that, I think I really have not been able to come up with a solution. Perhaps in this discussion, we can encourage people to speak about it more openly, to try and to address the challenges. We've got COP26 coming up in the UK later this year. Hopefully, some solutions might be identified. Let me stop there, because it's a passionate issue for me and I tend to talk a lot. Yeah. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, President Anote-Tong, for your also call to action to come up with solutions that have a human face and take into account a human aspect. Important thing you say is that the climate crisis is not like an apocalypse. With an apocalypse, and I quote Roy Scranton, you wake up the next morning and you might push a squeaking shopping cart down the road with a shotgun at the ready, a burnt Tesla and nothing else. But with climate change, the catastrophe is ongoing. It is only increasing. So there is no escape, you say. Second, we have to find ways to change course, to limit these impacts and even get to a 2 or a better 1.5 degree world as we agreed in the Paris Agreement. But while we are working on that, it has to be humanitarian. It has to have a human aspect. We have to be radically inclusive, making sure that we care, the North for the South and for each other. And with that migration with dignity, as you say it, making sure that there is a right for everyone, that justice, climate justice is taken care of, is part of your call to action. Thank you very much, President Anote-Tong. I go to Salim Hook. Salim, you experience, of course, these challenges in Bangladesh. You've been rallying the world on climate action and sustainability action across. First question to you, also this personal one. Why it is what you do, and also how you see this world of taking action from your perspective and the Bangladesh perspective.
Thank you very much, Hank, and congratulations to Kadir for your book. I look forward to seeing it. I remember we had some good times when you visited Dhaka in your travels. So my background, Hank, is in science. You know, I studied science, biology. I taught science in a university. I'm a university professor. But then I started looking at the issue of climate change and the impacts of climate change, particularly in my country, Bangladesh, but then in other vulnerable developing countries as well. And I became more and more worried about the science. I wrote a lot of papers on the impacts of climate change. And then I felt like President Tong did, that this was a moral issue. It was, you know, it was not right that the poorest people on the planet who are contributing the least to the problem are the ones suffering from the impacts of rich people around the world, even rich people in their own countries. So this really gave me the spirit of working on this issue. And I had the good fortune of actually spending a few days with President Tong in Maldives when President Nasheed initiated the Climate Vulnerable Forum and brought together the vulnerable countries. President Nasheed, at that time, the president of the Maldives, invited me very kindly to come and speak to them as an expert. We spent several days together in Male. And then out of that came the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which President Nasheed chaired for a couple of years. And then President Tong took over the chairmanship. And over the years, this has moved on from one country to the other. And right now, my Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina of Bangladesh, is the current chair. She's just taken over a few months ago and will be the president of the Climate Vulnerable Forum for the next 2 years, particularly during COP26 as well. So this movement of the vulnerable countries has been going forward quite significantly, and it has moved from advocacy. First was, they were the big advocates for 1.5, by the way. It was, you wouldn't have had 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement without the vulnerable countries advocating very, very strongly for that. But now, also in a practical sense, because climate change is actually happening, we need to deal with it in reality. And one of the interesting developments that has happened here is that under the Climate Vulnerable Forum, the finance ministers of the same countries, they have formed a group. They call themselves the V20, sort of opposed to the vulnerable 20 as opposed to the G20, but it's not 20 countries. It's all nearly 50 countries of the CVF, and finance ministers who are not really negotiators or don't really understand, the global negotiations on climate change, but they do understand the impacts of climate change in their own countries and the need to deal with it in reality. And they're actually allocating their own budgets to tackling climate change. And one of the issues, as President Tong has really highlighted, is the issue of forced displacement or climate migration that is going to happen, whether within a country, in Bangladesh, for example, people moving from the low-lying coast into the cities, in Dhaka city in particular, or across borders into other countries as well. This is something that is no longer happening in the future. It's happening now. We need to deal with it and we need to work on it. The last point I'll make is that what my focus of my work is on adaptation, helping the most vulnerable communities in the most vulnerable countries, including the CVF countries, to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And I do a lot of work on what we call locally led adaptation. And you may recall that just a couple of weeks ago, we had the Climate Adaptation Summit led by the Netherlands Prime Minister. And then we had a series of anchor events around the world on different aspects of that. My country, my Prime Minister and myself and others, we hosted the anchor event on locally led adaptation. And that we feel is something that it links vulnerable communities everywhere, including in the Netherlands, including in Europe, including in the Pacific Islands, including in Bangladesh. Everywhere is specific, but we are linked through this global problem. And there are ways in which we can share knowledge with each other and hopefully help each other tackle the problem. It's still, quite dangerous. It's going to be very, very difficult getting to 1.5, but we have not given up hope. We are continuing to push for that. I'll stop there for now.
Thanks very much, Salim, also for the message of hope, but your ongoing rally. And I do remember why 1.5 got into the Paris Agreement. I also would like to note that the 2 degrees in the Paris Agreement is a pledge. The 1.5 is a promise. Then I refer to the now climate envoy for President Biden, John Kerry, who at the Climate Adaptation Summit you just referred to said, 1.5 degrees is our best adaptation strategy. 1.5 as a threshold coming from the United States is a different sound, you could say. The second thing John Kerry said was, we will make sure that we deliver on our promise for the global south. And this is, of course, the loss and damage conversation, that we will make sure that we leave no one behind. Of course, that is a pledge in the context of the United Nations, but it does mean that the vulnerable around the world, as you addressed, are hit hardest by the impacts of climate change, have the hardest time to get back on their feet. It takes them the longest and the most effort. And they did not contribute massively to this changing climate. So there has to be more than empathy around the world. This is really about global collaboration. So running from advocacy to finance to global collaboration, that was clear. Thank you very much, Salim. Then I go to Diederik Samsom. Diederik, thank you again for joining. As said, from Greenpeace to national politics in the Netherlands, and from national politics now to the European stage. I'm pretty sure you you did this by deliberation. There is a reason why you are where you are. And I'd like to know how you see that you and the partners at the EU can help us in Europe, countries, vulnerable communities, but also help Europe across the world do better when it comes to climate action. Diederik, floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Yes, there's a reason that I'm sitting at the place that I'm sitting right now. Having fought for sustainability all my adult life, it's obviously not a bad start to start for Greenpeace. But in Greenpeace, you can make a global impact for a day, or maybe two. After the banners have gone, the ship is towed away by the police. Most of the time, too often, things go back to normal, where they shouldn't be. So after having done that for 7 years and spent all my life there, obviously you start to feel that you want to make a lasting impact. And that's where politics is. That's why you have to go into that difficult arena called politics. So I went to Den Haag, national politics, where you can make a lasting impact on a national level. And you do realize, and we all know, that the problem we are talking about is a global one, is a planetary one. So you have to make a bigger impact than on a national level. You actually want to go to a global level. Yeah. And there you find yourself in a trade-off between the decisiveness of your politics within the UN or the non-global but still continental impact you can make on the EU level. And I, having been here for a year right now, think I'm in the right place to make the biggest impact possible by trying to turn Europe into that sustainable direction with the Green Deal that we designed as the broad concept, the coherent, consistent plan, not only to fight climate change, but also to stop the loss of biodiversity, to stop the pollution of our environment. Those ambitious goals as a continent in one coherent plan, we obviously have the audacity that we think we can take the world along in that journey. And last year, maybe with some luck, we saw the first sprouts of that happening. China is pledging climate neutrality, or I should say carbon neutrality, which is different. And they don't do it halfway of the century, but a bit later. Obviously, another president, another administration in the US is a difference between night and day in terms of their pledges. And you already referred to John Kerry, who obviously still is in his honeymoon, and he has to face the Senate and the Congress and has to make that all into real policy, but it's a promising start. And what can we do? What are we doing? We're not sitting idle on our hands waiting for the rest of the world to join. We try to take the lead also on adaptation. Next week, the European Union will adopt its new adaptation strategy, which has, well, too many to talk about right now, but in short, it's about much more speed, it's about much more coordination, it's about much more nature, and it's about much more solidarity. We are in a hurry, also with adaptation, and even in Europe, that safe place on Earth, you could think, is already suffering from climate change. Nothing compared to what the rest of the world is suffering, but still it raises the sense of urgency of our European population. We need much more coordination because we are one continent and we need to take one approach. Climate change doesn't respect borders whatsoever. We need much more nature. Nature-based solutions are the way to go in order to adapt to climate change because they have synergistic effects with biodiversity, with actually also mitigating climate change. So that's the way to go. And the most important part is solidarity. The rest of the world is suffering mainly because of the emissions that the European continent emitted in the last 150 years, together with some others still. But we need to be aware of that, and we need to share that burden. We hope we can also take the lead in a very important aspect of Glasgow next year, or actually at the end of this year now, which is climate finance. There needs to be enough of it, and we are not anywhere near that point. And the distribution of it needs to be correct, both geographically, but also between mitigation and adaptation. And we hope to set an example next week saying, okay, this is our vision for how that should be done. This is our contribution to that money. And also that is a journey that we want to set the example and take the rest of the world along.
Are you hopeful, Diederik? Because you, I think the strategy is sound. You really talk about European leadership in this changing course, because we saw the last 5 years after the Paris Agreement that it is very hard for the world to say goodbye to past practices, reinvent nature-based solutions, mitigate climate, say goodbye to fossil fuels, really focus on circular and so forth. But you sound hopeful in the sense that there is, with coordination, a European leadership, following courses around nature and solidarity, that change is possible.
Yes, I've never been more hopeful than right now, actually. Right. And that's for a few reasons, but two of them stand out. One of them is obvious, it's technology. We've seen mind-boggling developments in the last 5 to 10 years. The last decade was actually amazing. The problem is that the next decade needs to be even more amazing to get there, but okay, we are on the right track. If you look at what offshore wind is doing, solar panels, electrical vehicles, 10 years ago, they were nowhere, anywhere in a cost curve. Now they are basically becoming mainstream. And in my conversations I have with, for instance, the automobile industry, one of the most conservative, but also biggest industries of Europe, you can see, you can feel, you can hear that those CEOs of those companies, they've seen it. They've looked around the corner and they've seen that new future. They know the internal combustion engine is going to end pretty soon, by the way. So technology is one, but that's not going to make all the difference, but it's an important part. Much more important is the atmosphere in the society. And that is one reason, and one reason alone, it's our young people. It's the young generation that is at the moment changing the world. It's that one little girl, obviously, sitting out there somewhere in Sweden in front of a school that made a movement, but it's actually all of them. I just mentioned the CEOs of car manufacturers, and when you sit and talk to them, somewhere in that conversation, they start to talk about their own children. And about the fact that their own children are asking pertinent questions on the kitchen table. Small questions about eating meat, larger questions about flying to Bali for a holiday, but also existential questions. Hey, Dad, what are you doing to save my future? And when that dad happens to be the CEO of a large car maker, that's a pretty existential question. And that's not only for CEOs, that's also for civil servants, for politicians. I'm convinced that at the moment, the young generation of the world is making the difference that many young generations before them didn't do. Yeah. My generation didn't do that. And maybe the generation of the 60s, I'm a little too young to have that, or to have experienced that part of history, but still. And I see what a speed of change that can encompass, because only 1.5 years ago, mentioning a 55% target for Europe was for the very few. Marjan Minnesma talked about it. A few others dared to bring it up. But in the political mainstream, it was seen as way too radical. And actually, we are now at the point where we say at least 55. At least 55. And that's adopted by countries like Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, countries that you never imagined that such a thing would happen only a few years ago, only a year ago, actually. So that makes me pretty optimistic. And at the same time, I do realize, I'm well aware of the fact that this is just the beginning. If we don't keep this speed from happening or keep it at this pace for the next 2 decades, it will be all for nothing. So we have quite a big job to do.
Thanks, Diederik. We know it, we see it, we need to change it. And these questions like, what are you doing, are of critical importance. I know Marianne and Kadir have questions, but I go to Anote and Salim first. In this context of this global south and north, you hear what Diederik is saying. You also hear what is coming out of Europe and out of the US. Is this also part of a global change you experience in the Pacific and in Asia? Anote first and then Salim. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. You know, I think it's related to the question that I think Kadir, you raised about the why. You know, why are we responding so well to the COVID-19 pandemic challenge, but not so much with the climate change, which is possibly more disastrous at the end? And the simple reason is because with COVID-19, everybody is at risk, the North and the South. But with climate change, there are opposing camps. Those that believe that they stand to lose by putting into place the remedies that are needed to deal with climate change. And I think that is the difference, because in climate change, we have the fossil fuel industry, which has been resisting anything to deal with climate change. And those of us at the other end, which have become the victims of what is happening with climate change. And there you have the North and the South. It's in my mind, sometimes I feel it's a class division of the rich and the poor, okay? And the North and the South. So there it is. So we need to overcome this. We need to come to terms with the reality that climate change is not a risk only for countries like mine, but it's actually a global phenomenon. Everybody is at risk. I think this was particularly highlighted in the events that are happening with the fires in the US West Coast, in Australia in 2019, 2020. I mean, these are unprecedented, and they won't get any better. They'll get worse.
Yeah.
And I think this is what we need to come to terms with.
Yeah, but
realize
but what you also say, Anote, is that floods and droughts and wildfires occur everywhere, but the impact of them is driving inequality. Because we see the most vulnerable hit hardest. So we need the stronger ones to step up and reach out to the most vulnerable to ensure that there is this human aspect, as you talked about, that there is climate justice. And I think when Diederik was talking about solidarity, I think this is really, we have to deliver on that promise again, making sure that reaching out is also really about climate justice. Salim, do you experience change, or is this gap between North and South only increasing?
No, I actually feel that it's decreasing myself. I think, you know, we are all living in a globalized world. So let me share an anecdote. I mentioned that in my center in Bangladesh, we work on locally led adaptation. We set up a platform of universities and researchers and government officials and others in Bangladesh called Gobeshona, which is a Bangla word for research, where we bring together everybody once a year in a big annual conference every January, which we host in my university. We bring several hundred people over several days. We've done that for the last 7 years, every January. But this year, because of the COVID-19 pandemic and travel restrictions, we made it into a virtual event rather than a physical in-person event. And by virtue of it being a virtual event, we also made it into a global event, not just a Bangladesh-focused event. And I reached out to friends around the world, from the Pacific Islands to the Asia, to Africa, to Europe. We had a session with the Netherlands, and then to America. And I got an overwhelming response on the theme of locally led adaptation. These are local actions to adapt everywhere around the world. And we got so many requests for sessions. We had more than 90 sessions, which we ran 24 hours over 7 days, 24/7. We started with 8 hours for the Asia Pacific, and then 8 hours for Africa and Europe time zones, and then 8 hours for North Central and Southern America, and then back again 7 times. And we did this just before the Adaptation Summit, 7 days of linking up local actors on adaptation to climate change around the world, from all over the world. We learned from each other, we shared lessons from each other, and we have now decided that this Gobeshona conference, annual conference, we will keep it online even after people can start traveling again, hopefully soon, and we will keep it a global conference where we will learn from each other. We will connect North and South. People working in Netherlands working on adaptation locally in their places, linking up with people in Bangladesh. Obviously, every place is different, but there are great similarities, in fact, in terms of what people are doing and can learn from each other in the context of tackling climate change, particularly adaptation to climate change at the local level.
Yeah, thanks, Salim. It's also a promising sound in a very challenging context where impacts of climate change are only increasing. And thanks for sharing that. Dorte, Marjan, and Kadir, questions from you to the three gentlemen. And I start with Marjan here at the table.
Yeah, I have a question to Diederik. Nice to see you over there. I just don't really know what you are doing there, so I'm very curious. Besides, say, vision, Green Deals and things on paper, what can you or the EU do in making real change? And I'm asking that because I was wondering whether the EU could say, for example, in 2030, only electric vehicles, no coal-fired power plants, all houses, no gas-fired installations anymore. So say 10 big, hairy goals. Is that something that you see as possible, or does that have to be done at the national level?
No, it will be done on a European level. You just mentioned two examples of those, cars and houses, and we legislate that. If you ask what I'm doing, basically, well, Europe doesn't put down solar panels themselves, so we are a legislative body, but we have, for instance, the so-called CO2 emission standards for cars, which tell the European car manufacturers what they can put on the road. And we're going to and at the moment, they are still allowed to have almost 100 gram per kilometer, which is a normal Volkswagen. That's sort of the standard right now, which is by no means enough. So we're going to pull that line down to 0. And obviously, it depends on what the ambition of the member states we can muster. But we think that line touches the 0 somewhere between 230 and 235. So, and you want it at 230. Stick to that for a while, because then we might get there. But obviously, I can think of a few countries, not Germany alone, but Slovakia, the biggest, where actually all the cars are made. They might want to take a little longer, and the same goes for houses. We have the the buildings directive for houses, which tell you what a house should look like, what the conditions are for a house, and we are used to them. A house should have a roof, for instance. That's a very basic thing. But why not prescribe that a house should have an energy label somewhere between A and C, and not worse than that? Well insulated, solar panels on the roof, and a smart grid within. We can prescribe that. We actually do that. The point is, at the moment, the ambitions in those regulations are by nowhere ambitious enough. But we are changing that, and actually at the moment we are changing it for the European Union, quite an incredible speed. So we come up with a whole package in June, on the 30th of June, which will have all the regulations that are needed to meet the 55%, or I should say at least 55%. And obviously on the pathway, because that's just an intermediate step on the pathway to climate neutrality before the half of the century.
Thanks, Diederik. So this concept of big, hairy goals, as Marjan says it, you not only take this on, this is also a way how you can see and achieve change. Kadir?
Yeah, I had a question for Arnaud de Tong, because you were speaking about climate refugees. I think people speak a lot about climate refugees. Do you feel that there's any international action being taken? Do you know of people who were actually granted asylum for climate reasons?
Yes, it's yeah. There was a case in New Zealand where one of our nationals pleaded a case of being a climate refugee, and it went to court, but it was rejected in the New Zealand courts. But I think it's maybe it was the New Zealand and maybe the international community was not ready to deal with that. I'm aware that there is no such definition in the international set of words dictionary that of climate refugees, and I think that's been one of the obstacles. And but I think it's one of those things that a simple process like that can actually result in humanitarian issues. Yeah. And I think we need to be more effective, more responsive to the current events of today. I think those definitions must have been defined some decades ago. The world is different today from what it was some decades ago. So we need to look at things in the light of current events, in the light of current challenges. And I think that goes for many of the issues of the processes at the international level. I don't believe that the world has come to terms with what is happening with the dislocation of people. I mean, in Europe had with the massive migration of people from North Africa, they responded very well initially, but not anymore. And so this is the kind of thing that's going to happen on a greater level with as the climate change impacts get worse. And we're talking about people from my country maybe having to relocate somewhere else in a different country. That's going to create stresses, and there are no processes in place to deal with this. How can we integrate people into a new society? How can we educate the people that are going there? How can we educate the people that will be receiving these communities? And this is the whole idea of migration with dignity, the concept. It's about preparing people, acknowledging the reality that this is inevitable. Let's prepare for it rather than ignore it.
Thank you, Anote. Solidarity comes in many phases, but we know the UN estimates that the increase in migrants is towards 2050 is 250 million people. So we have to make sure we have that solidarity. Just to check, Diederik left because he had to leave at 4:45. No, you're still there, but you're almost, you have to go. Yeah, I know.
1 minute.
Yeah, okay. Last question for Dorte to the panel. Dorte.
Yes, Diederik, it's actually to you because I need a little more shower of your optimism before you leave. Because I would say as a European citizen, it is often quite depressing that the unity, the will to work together of the European nation is not always convincing. And, it's nice that we say we're going to go forward in Europe and we're going to do this and that. But in reality, are we going to do it? And then you can broaden it out and say, yes, maybe Europe can do it. But how are we going to reach the world? How are we going to reach Russia and China, India, and the big nations that are very important in this balance? And do you think the COP is going to be the most powerful tool to reach these goals in the future? Or can we find other ways of doing it more efficiently? That's a big question. Let's have some optimism. Thank you.
Well, Diederik.
I'm certain that the COP or the UNFCCC is not the most efficient way to do things, but it might in the end be the most inclusive way to do things. The UNFCCC is really remarkable in its inclusiveness all over the world. It's completely different from other worldwide organizations like the WTO, which is actually almost the opposite in terms of the power of the WTO is in the hands of 2 countries. And here we are in a one man, one vote or one country, one vote system, which is highly inefficient. But if we manage and not give up, look at where we've come so far. Obviously, Copenhagen was a complete disaster. Paris was quite a remarkable success. And what we are going to work on from now until 11th of November is to make Glasgow the final success for putting the world on this journey towards sustainability. And as I said before, I've never been more hopeful than that, because indeed within Europe, there was a lot of skepticism. Can you get Poland along in this -55? Yes, we can. it took us a night, and I'm not going to describe you what it took, what the discussions were in that night. But yes, they are on board. And now we have to move on. John Kerry is, as a climate envoy, really running ahead of himself, maybe, but he is preparing the grounds. India is something that we are looking at with some doubts and also some worry about what their intentions are. China, obviously, but Japan already embarked on this journey for climate neutrality at the half of the century, and so did South Korea, not unimportant. And so will South Africa, which is then a very important cornerstone in that hugely important continent. We're going to work day and night from now on until November to get that success in Glasgow, to get a table of NDCs for the experts, a table of commitments from national countries and regions that will add up to the maximum 1.5 degree. I'm not sure whether we will be successful, but I'm going to give it all my best.
Yeah. Thank you, Diederik. I know you have to go. I want to thank you for sharing your optimism, your commitment. We have our own John Kerry in Brussels, I'm pretty sure. Wish you luck on your quest, because it also feels like a quest. And do know how to find us, because you know that the people you have in this round table are definitely on your side. So thanks so much for joining, and best of success in Brussels.
Thank you.
Anout and Salim, you're still here. Kadir has a question for Salim.
Sure.
Yeah, Salim. Yeah, we met, and obviously the Netherlands and Bangladesh have a lot in common, right? We are all both low-lying countries. We are deltas. Mm-hmm. The Dutch are also known for their expertise on coastal defenses, on water management. But Bangladesh developed a very ambitious plan, which is called Delta Plan 2100. And I would like you to say a little bit about this. And when we met last time in Dhaka, you said something quite remarkable. You said maybe it's the Dutch who should come here and learn from us instead of the other way around. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. Thank you very much, Kadir. So you're quite right. The Netherlands and Bangladesh share a very similar kind of geography in that we are living on the delta of rivers, and we both have low-lying sea coast that is susceptible to sea level rise. The Netherlands is very different from Bangladesh in that you have high technology. You can protect your coast, and you have actually been able to live below the sea level, and you can also raise your sea defenses to take care of potential sea level rise. Bangladesh's coast, the delta of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers, they are, many times bigger than the Dutch rivers and coasts. So for us to do that kind of civil construction and protection is just not viable, except for small pockets where we have, big cities or infrastructure that needs to be defended. But the whole coast cannot be defended in the same Dutch manner. Although, obviously, we can learn from the Dutch hydrologists, engineers, and in fact, almost 90%, I think, of Bangladeshi civil engineers or hydraulic engineers have studied in the Netherlands and for many, many years. And so there's a very strong knowledge component. But what I was referring to when I made that comment of it being a two-way street in terms of learning is about how people are accommodating themselves to the issues of sea level rise in Bangladesh. And it's about social capital. And as I mentioned earlier, what we term locally led adaptation, the vulnerable people are not sitting idle. They are doing things. They are preparing themselves. They are tackling the problems of climate change as we speak, and doing it with whatever little they have. They don't have much, but they are doing whatever they can. And there is a lot of social capital that poor people have that is something that is very valuable in protecting each other. And that's something that I think that richer countries where people are more atomized. They don't work with each other. They don't help each other. They live in their own houses and look after themselves. In our country, that doesn't happen. People look after each other. Their neighbors are the first people to come to help you. And so that social capital that we have, I think, is something that rich countries, not necessarily just the Netherlands, but richer countries can learn from. So learning to adapt to climate change is a two-way street. It's not about technology from the north to the south. It's about learning to tackle problems which can be in both directions. We learn from you, but you can learn from us as well.
Thank you so much, Salim, and that is so true. And it is that social capital, but it's also indigenous knowledge that Diederik was talking about nature-based solutions. Part of those lessons come from indigenous knowledge and capacity. Finding ways to scale that capacity up, making sure to replicate so there is impact in the context of a changing climate, as well as helping curb changing climate for the better, is of critical importance. So thanks for sharing as well. We move to Marianne and Dorte. And of course, Salim and Anota, you're more than welcome to join. But I learned that because it is already very late, you would like to go to bed. Which is totally understandable. And I'm pretty sure we really thank you from our hearts for staying up so late and joining us for this debate. And wishing you luck, safety, but also a lot of inspiration and justice along your ways. And pretty sure we will see each other in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And congratulations and all the best for the launch once again, Kadir.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Really amazing.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
I take my leave now. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. The Pacific, Asia, and Brussels have left us, but we are still in good company. Dorte and Marianne, I look at the both of you, and I'd like also to hear a personal view next to this professional. You have committed your lives to climate research, climate action, not for nothing. Is it doom and gloom, only dark? Is the reason why you do is this, do you see light somewhere? And what are those sparks? But also, what are the necessary steps we have to take as communities, individuals, and as a world? Marianne, first.
It's a big question. Do we have an hour?
Yeah, we have some time. Yeah.
I think with Christiana Figueres, I think we should be stubborn optimists.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that I don't see the downside too. It's still possible to stick to 1.5 to 2 degrees, but it depends on what we do the next 10 years. And the Dutch way of what we call polderen, sitting together and waiting until we all agree, is not applicable anymore. And I've been for 6 years director of an Institute for Transitions. They look at big changes, but they also say it takes 2 generations. We don't have 2 generations anymore. So this whole idea, what the young people say, and a couple of people earlier, that it is a crisis and we should treat it as a crisis, that's exactly what's needed right now. And I'm very curious if that will be the spirit of this next COP26, what we talked about in Scotland. I like to make it very practical because all those words are nice. We have simply in 2008 already imported the first electric vehicles and made the market ready and imported 50,000 solar panels and brought the prices 1/3 down. We now have made hundreds of houses energy neutral just to show that it's possible, that we don't have to wait. That was why I asked Diederik about those big hairy goals, because I think that's the only way forward, to say in 2030 we quit coal, we quit all combustion cars, etc., etc. Say, make very strict regulations and tell people now you have 10 years. So you don't have to put your car away and everything else tomorrow. But once something new is needed or something is broken, then you turn to the sustainable solution. Because for everything there are sustainable solutions within 10 years, only not for flying. And that's why we should make flying simply less possible and extremely expensive. But all other things, there are solutions. We don't have to wait for 10 years of innovation. It's nice, it makes it cheaper, and it can help us to make it even better, but everything is on the table. And Diederik must know that, and that's why I hope that Europe simply is going to say, in 10 years' time, we just stop with the unsustainable things. And there's many people that won't like it, but you see the pictures of Kadir, we don't like that either. No. And if you would be able to have a time machine and live in 2080 and then look in the world and think, shit, I wished we had changed everything in 2020. That feeling. And that's why I like the book so much, because you have to put it in pictures, in motion, because only words is not enough. And I hope that somehow the next few years, and of course the young people help a lot, but I think it's a pity that we need that. We tell the same stories, I guess, and people just simply need to listen to the scientists, look around, come out of their corner, and then make the change within an incredibly short time frame, but it's still possible.
Thanks, Marianne. The thing you say is that by making it practical, by doing it, and I know this from my practice, you can start small, but then when scaling it up and replicating, you have that impact we need. In the context of this COVID recovery, the world, and this is really the world, the North and the South and the investors, are spending already trillions and trillions of dollars, euros and yen around the world that can actually be allocated to the right causes. There is a choice. We can put every dollar and we can put the burden on the investor, public and private, show you deliver on the Paris goals, show you deliver on the SDGs. Because then that sparks, as you said, the 100 houses, the nature-based solutions in Bangladesh or in the Pacific, can actually be relatively faster, be scaled up. Are those the commitments you expect that need to come out of a COP in Glasgow, as was discussed before?
Well, that's what I would hope for. At the moment, I don't see this, because we are giving in the Netherlands a lot of money to companies to survive COVID, but we don't say if you do something very unsustainably, you won't get it, and if you do something sustainable, you get it. We just give it to everybody, and that's probably.
But the agreement, the agreement in Brussels on the COVID recovery package was that the recovery has to be aligned with the Green Deal. And as Diederik says, the regulation that will come from Brussels, that's going to be strict, driving CO2 emissions to zero. So is that the way?
That's why I asked him what he's doing concretely, because I don't see it all. But I would say if they are doing this, then they must make it a real transition package. So not making steel a little bit less emitting, but make steel without emissions. And force the steel and the chemical factories to sit together and to make sure that they use each other's emissions as raw material and so on. So you really have to force a major breakthrough. So it's not a bit less and then put it under the ground with CCS. No, make the real transformation. And I'm not, I really don't know. No. It might be happening, but I don't know.
It has to be a package deal in the context of the Paris Agreement.
And
otherwise it won't
really
work.
Transformational, not a bit less.
No. Dorte, from a scientific perspective, you do the research, you know what is happening in the Arctic and how the tipping points are changing our current day lives, but will change our future. Is there hope? Because you, not for nothing, asked the question earlier, or from a scientific point, you don't see that?
Well, I think being a scientist and especially working with the ice on Greenland, we drill the ice cores and look back in time, and we see the ability of the climate to change and to change to warmer and colder states back in time. And now when we have the satellites where we are able to kind of look over the whole world, we can see how the sea level is changing, how the temperature is changing, how the ice is melting. I mean, we really have enough knowledge now clearly to understand what's happening. Of course, there's a lot more we would like to understand, but it's really no excuse for us to say we can't act because we don't know what's happening. Then I find it's quite a challenge to sit with so much knowledge and really know how important it is, and it's so difficult, you know, catching everyone. And for us, the IPCC reports are one of the ways we try to communicate, because it's kind of a negotiation between the political system, the decision makers, and the scientists. But we must admit, as scientists, we find that the IPCC reports are too conservative. And we do expect, for example, sea level rise, you know, the probability of having higher sea level rise than the IPCC reports predict are kind of believed by most people that really work with ice. But now knowing all these things, we also know that right now we are emitting CO2 to the atmosphere. I know I'm stating this for people who know it, and we struggle just not accelerating it, not emitting more and more every year. But you know, to reach the 1.5 goal in Paris, it's not enough that we stop all emissions of CO2, and that's no cars, you know, no use of fossil fuels, and also what do we do with the agriculture and other things that also emit a lot. But it's not only that. To reach it, we also have to capture CO2 and take it down from the atmosphere. And I must say, especially, you know, now it's 5-6 years after the Paris Agreement, and we haven't really moved. We have a lot of hopes and ideas, but we haven't really moved. Is it realistic? Are we really going to make it? And sometimes, and I know this is nearly heretic to say, I think it doesn't always help us to put a goal that might be impossible to reach. If we, for example, set 2 degrees instead of 1.5, then our governments could make a strategy that would be supported in the democratic system a little better. People will say, yes, that's right, I won't go to Thailand, and yes, it's right, I will have an electrical car. But if you ask them to reach goals that they can see are impossible, perhaps the result is you get nothing, that the governments won't commit and won't try to make action plans to reach this goal, because in reality, it is really close to being impossible. And I love Dietrich and his optimism, and it's my highest goal, we can reach it. But I also think we have to be a little careful and ask for things that in the end we really know deep within ourselves that it might not be possible. And I hope you don't share these thoughts with me, because I feel very bad about saying them. But you know, if I'm allowed to continue a little, you know, the COVID-19 has taught us that we can actually act a lot, and at least it's taught our populations a lot about an exponential function, right? So people can see how, you know, if you just increase a little every year, it's going to go totally crazy. And you know, it's actually exactly the same with the climate change. And perhaps we can use this will for action and this understanding of the situation to move faster than people would do elsewise. Because even though I agree with you, Marianne, I actually agree with you, everything you said, it was great. I think, you know, that democratic systems are not very well suited to make fast actions as we need right now. But we can do it if the will is there. But we need the will to be there, because that's the nature of democracy.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I need one positive thing at the end, because I've been taught we cannot move the people by being pessimistic. And I think that's also something we need to work on. You need to catch people with positive things and tell them we can do it, because else it's not going to happen. And I think there are a few things that are happening, much too slowly, but they are happening. Women are getting more educated. And this means that the growth of our population is decreasing, and we have a lot more sensible people that take share of the responsibility of changes. For me, that's important.
Yeah, on the latter, but on all the other things you said, I couldn't agree more. But I understand also the challenges from your perspective. And you also say something that I'd like to ask also to the group. You say COVID-19 shows that action is taken. It's treated as a crisis, although not as successful everywhere around the world. There are good and bad and better examples, you could say. But that also tells us something. One, that we need a crisis to respond to. While with climate change, the crisis is here, but we want to make sure it doesn't get worse. And you actually say it will get worse. And with that getting worse, that crisis might drive action. Too late for many, but perhaps not too late for the world. Is this the future that we see? Is that the crisis impact will only increase? And only because of that increase of impact and the loss of lives and valuable assets that we will start to move? Or is there more hope? Kadir?
Well, unfortunately, if we look at history, it seems to be the case. You know, I mean, there was a Katrina necessary for things to happen in New Orleans. There was a Sandy necessary in New York a while ago. In the Netherlands, we had an enormous flood in 1953. That actually made us reconsider our coastal defenses. So, to some extent, I'm afraid so. But what I'm curious also, and I would like to ask Marjan, is because what Marjan and Agenda did was exceptional. They actually brought the Dutch government to court and demanded that the Dutch court would cut emissions by 25%. And the government appealed. They appealed again, and then at the Supreme Court, Agenda won the case. But it was said that it had to be done on the 31st of December last year. It was a ruling, and even with COVID-19, it seems that we didn't meet this
goal.
That we met this goal. So, Marjan, what's next? I mean, if even the Supreme Court, the Dutch Supreme Court, had this ruling, and the Dutch government did not even lived up to?
It's not as bad. They started way too late because we won for the first time in 2015, and they should have taken action immediately, which the government didn't do. And then we won again in 2018, and they still didn't do anything. And then finally in 2019, when we won at the Supreme Court, they started to do something. They have closed one coal-fired power plant. There is a second one, if Europe agrees, which also will be closed. And the other remaining ones will have to go back to 35% of their capacity. And on top of that, we made a plan together with 800 organizations to reduce enough CO2 to make the goal. We call that the 54 solutions plan. And out of those 54, they are doing now roughly 30 of those solutions. They spend more than 3 billion at the moment carrying out those activities. But of course, they started too late. So they would have never have made it without COVID. We also told the government, well, we're not going back to court in December if you haven't made it. As long as we see a straight line down and you will make it a few months later, it's also fine. And actually, we don't really know how far they came last year because there are many results from COVID which are so-called second and third order, which are not there yet. I think they've come pretty close. But it should be structural measures. So on top of that, they should do more, and they are working on an additional package. But if we have the feeling that this government or the next that will this year be coming is not doing enough, we can go back to court and demand more action. And if they don't do that, they will have to pay a fine for every month that they're not doing enough. So we still have a very strong way to push them. But I hope we still have states in which we live up to a ruling of the Supreme Court. So I hope we don't have to go back to court.
And the new government has to deliver on that same ruling.
Yeah.
And second, it is now the opportunity for a cabinet formation to actually incorporate all your 54 actions, or perhaps even more. So I imagine you already have a plan of 108 actions that a new government can actually take into their agreement.
Yeah, well, the good thing is we made a plan both for this year and for the year thereafter, and that's enough for the 55% that the Netherlands has to live up to now in 2030. So there are enough ideas, and usually the government is not very creative. They think in terms of subsidy schemes or regulations, and we had very many creative solutions that also we offered with the 800 organizations to carry out. And I think that that's a new way that the governments can do much more than they previously did. Yeah. And I think another good outcome of our court case is that we now have a team, a climate litigation network, that helps court cases all over the world. Right. You've maybe seen that the Supreme Court in Ireland also forced the Irish government to make a better plan. Well, we helped that one. And a couple of weeks ago in France, they also said, well, you're not living up to your own Paris Agreement. You should do more. So we have inspired very many countries to do the same. And actually, governments are there to protect their citizens. So if you don't do enough, and that what is enough is determined by the countries themselves, because the 25% that our government has to do is not invented by us or by the court. That was what the Netherlands had signed for years and years in hundreds of documents. The only thing the court does is saying, if you say that's the absolute minimum, then you have to live up to it. And in that sense, it's good that we have courts all over the world that are now following that example.
Checks and balances in place. Yeah. I'm going to go to Dorte, but before that, I have a question from the audience that is listening in, and it's really to all of us, but also to Kadir, because Wieteke asks, how do we get your story, your book, the story you tell with the images and the background narrative to the schools, and from the schools to the parents. So changing behavior, culture through your book and your images to the schools. I don't have the answer, but could you imagine that making, I always said as a water envoy, water should be obligatory at the schools to talk about. No, we have to understand, but we have to talk about climate change at schools, and this is a way.
It's happening, you know, and it's very encouraging as well, because there's a still an exhibition in Amsterdam here at the Maritime Museum, which is next door. I had a lot of school groups, you know, primary school, 7 to 12 years old. I was always amazed how much they knew. You know, it's indeed, as was said earlier, and that's hopeful, right? It's the kids who tell their parents, why are you flying? Why are you still eating meat? Why do we have to drive the car? So, you know, I think it's the young generation which is hopeful, you know. We are probably not the ones who are really gonna move the world to a better world, but it's the young generation which will act, and which are angry as well, because you know, we had a great life, you know, welfare was growing, economies were growing, and they are paying the price, just like the people in the Pacific or in Bangladesh. And so, yes.
Every school in Europe should get your book. It's heavy enough also to hit someone with the head if he or she is not waking up. So
maybe a digital version.
And digital version.
A digital version. The wake up. I remember when I worked post Hurricane Sandy in New York, we did work with the schools. There was the harbor school that taught children what water was, and we brought the harbor school into our program. So the kids brought the parents to the projects, starting to understand that acting on climate was of critical importance. And this advocacy through kids, it's not that you use them at all, they use you to ensure that action is taken. So thanks, Wieteke, for that question.
I have one for Dorte.
Yeah, Kadir, I have one for Dorte and me too, so we can build on that.
But it was
go.
Yeah. No, I mean, Dorte, I'm also Dorte and I, we met in a very unusual place. We met at I think it was an altitude of 2,700 meters on the middle of the ice sheet of Greenland. And Dorte, you were leading an expedition, a scientific expedition, which was, I mean, incredible to see and to experience for a couple of days. Could you tell a little bit about this mission and to what extent this is connected? You haven't been able to do the final conclusion or your final findings, but could you elaborate a little bit on that, or say a little bit what this expedition is about and what it means for current sea level rise as well?
Yeah, well, first, now we just decided to cancel the expedition again this year due to COVID-19, but that's a totally different story. We're drilling, in an international team, we are drilling an ice core through one of the biggest ice streams in the Greenland ice sheet. And ice streams are very important to understand the sea level rise, because for Greenland, half the melt comes from the ice stream. It's like fast-flowing floods that cut themselves through the Greenland ice sheet and move with higher velocity out to the margin, where they float out on the water. And that's why there are ice streams, because they can glide out on the water instead of being stopped by the rocks, if you can say it in that way. And in Greenland, it's half the mass that comes out that way. In Antarctica, it's nearly all the mass, because it's so much colder, there's no melt along the coast. And we don't really understand how these ice streams are moving. We can't really model them. And if we are to predict sea level rise into the future, we need to understand these ice streams, because else we have no tools to predict how they will increase their velocity as the ocean warms and the ice becomes warmer. So that's actually the main reason of drilling the ice core, is to get down to the bottom and look at the bottom and see how the whole ice stream is moving. So this is kind of our contribution to understand the sea level. And some people have said it's the world's most dangerous uncertainty is the uncertainty about what the sea level rise will be in the future. And I can mention an example from our part of the world, the Netherlands or Denmark. We say the sea level rise in year 2100 would be about 60 centimeters, plus minus 60 centimeters, which in reality says it's between 0 and 1.2 meters. But that's really not very valuable knowledge. If we could say it was 80 centimeters, and we know it very certain, unless we change behavior, it will be 80 centimeters. It would be much easier to react. It would also be a much stronger message in relation to climate change, that we should not change our climate.
What's her best educated guess? I would like to know.
Yeah. Marianne has a follow-up question to you, Dorte, immediately.
Hi, Dorte. What's your best educated guess? What do you think it will be at 2100?
Well, I think we should expect it to be around 1 meter, but there is a small probability of having sea level rises up to 2, even 2.5 meters. And here we are talking about low probability, but very, very high impact. And this is the things that we find are ignored in the IPCC report, that they don't take the more unlikely probabilities, but that have really, really big impact. Yeah. It's like the 100-year storm. It's not so often, but when it comes, it's very serious. So I think we have to be prepared for higher sea level rises also in year 2100.
Thanks, Dorte, for sharing the insight in your research. And I immediately refer to what Wieteke asked us. Because Kadir made a book with your help. Your help, Marianne and Dorte and many others. And the book now tells a story of what is happening now and what will happen in the future to the world. But the story of both of you, Marianne and Dorte, is also you have good examples in practice, starting small, that need to be scaled up, but you also have good examples in lawsuits that you won, that you now replicate across the world. How do we get that story to the schools? And the same for you, Dorte. Your insights are often stuck within a scientific core of people. If we're lucky, it is staged at a political table and embraced, but most of the time it ends up in an IPCC report that is not always read. So how can we make sure that the messages you have will have the same impact as the book Kadir is now having on the table? Dorte.
Well, I think, you know, we do everything we can to reach the schools. I think the young people is the key. We need to communicate to the young people. It is the schools we need to hit. I mean, we also produce material and digital material for the schools so they can work with it. And in our group, we have a lot of high school classes that come and visit us, and they go and see the ice core storage. We tell them stories. We've just made a 3D movie, Kadir, walking around in the trenches, where you sit on a chair with the glasses on and you can walk down and see everything as you did. So we can show the kids that. So I think that's kind of the tools we have. I must say that in the end, I think what would really move the world is to have a crisis in Europe, in the US, in our own areas. This is what would move people and get us into the crisis situation where we can do things. Yeah. I'm afraid it's not enough it's in Bangladesh or in Kiribati. It has to be here between us. Yeah. I'm afraid I would say.
I'm afraid too, and I agree with you. I also work a lot with kids. They also come to me, and I was just sent a report, but they don't call it a report, but I don't have the good word, like a booklet. Two girls from a high school made yesterday on sea level rise in the Netherlands. And they used science and data, but also their own narrative. They, of course, got an A+. It's amazing. Them telling your story, I think, is the most powerful part. So thanks so much for also sharing how you work with schools. I go to Marianne, and then we have to almost close off. Marianne.
Well, I think a big Sandy here would help too. But I am of the opinion that we need to do it within 10 years. So before my children are in power, it's too late. So I focus on the people in power. And I give 150 speeches a year to particularly those people, and then I use a lot of the science. That's why I asked the question, because our worst case scenario 10 years ago was 1.20 meters. It's now 2.5 meters. And of course, you hope the worst case scenario is not happening. But if it changes within 10 years so much, then that should say something. And I can see that if I tell this story to people in power, they are shocked and they don't know this. So there's still too many things they don't know. And then you need to show the way out and kick ass. So I think we need all of it, but I don't want to turn to the children, because by the time they're in power, we are too late.
But I agree, and we need you to talk truth to power and continue that. But your work is also an inspiration for many young. So we will ask others to make sure that your work will resonate among them. I want to thank you both. We're at the end of this debate, and I'll give the last words to Kadir. But before that, I want to thank you both for your contributions, your great work, and wishing you best of success in everything you do. And hope we can share better stories in a year after the COP in Glasgow. Kadir, last words for you, the maker of this book, but also the one who's calling out to the world to take and step up efforts and take action.
Well, mostly I just want to, well, obviously for Marianne to be here and for Dorte still being here, and have Diederik Samson, Mr. Anouk de Tong, Salim Hoek, all on today joining for this panel. But obviously I'm very happy that this book is there, and I want to thank you especially, Henk, because without you, this wouldn't have been there, because you kept me on track and you advised me often. So I want to thank you for that. And as you probably have seen, it's incredibly beautiful designed. And I would like to thank Jeroen Kummer of Kummer & Herman and Simon Burer for making this happen. And obviously my publisher, Lano, who was had enough trust in us that we could do this in these times, in COVID times, is really great. And Michael Huizer, who's the director of the Maritime Museum, the exhibition is still there. If the exhibition wouldn't have been there, this book wouldn't have been here. No. So thank you all, and thank you. I thought this was really, hopefully, inspiring and fruitful and necessary, and that we can really come to a call for action.
Yeah, thanks so much. A call to action. Now, no time to waste. Thank you, Pakhuis de Zwijger, for hosting us. We close this reading Kadir's book, being inspired to do better. Thank you, Dorte. Stay safe. Thank you, Marianne. Stay safe. Thank you, audience.